Well, welcome to this talk for ALACT. ALACT stands for the Association for Informal Logic and Critical Thinking. I am Donna Warren at the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point, and I am delighted today to introduce David Hitchcock, who is a professor emeritus of philosophy at McMaster University in Hamilton, Canada, who is here to talk to us about defining anti-Semitism. So I will leave it to you.
Well, thank you, Donna, for the introduction, and thank you to you and Kevin Posson and Frank Fair for inviting me to give a talk based on my book definition. I will now share my screen, and hopefully you will see what I see, which should be the title slide of the talk, Defining Anti-Semitism. So this talk is going to be partly an exposition of some of the ideas in my book definition. I'm trying to advance the slide and it's not happening. Just a moment. I think I may need to get out and come back in again to get into something that will enable me to activate the slideshow. Let's try that now. Yes, now it works. So I'm going to be partly expounding some of the ideas in my book definition, whose subtitle is A Practical Guide to Constructing and Evaluating Definitions of Terms. It is meant to be exactly that. It's an open access online in the Windsor Studies in Argumentation series. You can download it. If you want a hard copy, you can order it from Amazon quite inexpensively. And if you are writing something that involves defining terms or critiquing definitions of terms, I encourage you to go and have a look. There's an index, a table of contents, etc., and you can browse in it and might find something that is useful. I'm displaying on the right a photograph of the same Bob Ennis whom I see on the screen elsewhere at a younger age, because the first draft of this book was co-written by Bob and me as an outgrowth of his paper at the conference in Windsor in 2016 of the Ontario Society for Studies in Argumentation. After that, he bowed out, said he approved of the project, but basically the framework was jointly agreed to by both of us. And after he bowed out, I only made one change to the framework, and I did add a lot of things in response to the reviewers' suggestions. So I start out in the book by defining what I mean in the book by the word term, starting off with a simple definition in pretty well ordinary language, giving some examples of terms, some examples of things that are not terms according to the way I'm using the word, if somebody might think they are, and one borderline case, and I end up with a more highfalutin definition. And this tells the reader how to understand what I mean when I use the word term elsewhere in the book, but it also gives an example of how to define a term, namely the term term. I then say what it means to define a term. And this is, as you might appreciate, an extremely broad definition of defining a term. For example, it would include saying to a 2-year-old, yellow, while pointing to some yellow objects in order to define yellow for that term, to say to the 2-year-old what the term yellow means. And the statement produced by this act of defining would be a definition, excuse me. So the concept of a statement here is very broad. I'm just having trouble seeing all of this slide because I hope you can see it all. I have some photographs of you on the side that were blocking the view. So we distinguish, Bob and I, 3 dimensions of definition. One is the act of the person producing the definition. These are not mutually exclusive, but the basic act would be either reporting a meaning of a term which is indicating what it does mean, or stipulating a meaning of a term which is indicating what it should be taken to mean, or advocating a meaning of a term which is saying what it should mean. These are speech acts, which I'll talk about, and I'll organize the rest of the talk in terms of these 3 speech acts. A second dimension is the content of the definition, which in one sense is the words that are used in the defining part of the definition, and another sense is the information conveyed by the definition, which should be just enough for whatever purpose you have in defining the term. And the third dimension is the form of the definition, of which this book identifies 14. The most common of them by far being definition by genus and differentia, with which I suppose you are all familiar. Okay, so I'm hearing some sound from somebody. Maybe you could mute yourself. So let's turn to reporting a meaning. To report a meaning is to say how the term is used or has been used in at least one of its senses. It is an act that falls into the category identified by John Searle of representations, and it's either true or false. It is not a report of direct observation. We don't directly observe what a term means when it's being used. It is rather a kind of explanatory hypothesis. And so the justification of a reportive definition is by an inference to the best explanation, for which Bob and I gave 3 criteria taken actually from his 1962 landmark paper on a conception of critical thinking for purposes of assessment and instruction. So in the first place, an adequate explanatory hypothesis should explain the data in the sense that the data are what you would expect if the hypothesis were true. In the second place, it should be consistent with background knowledge and with other evidence. And in the third place, rival hypotheses should be inconsistent with some facts. And this concept of a rival hypothesis has to be used with care when you're evaluating different definitions of the same term in the same sense, because they're not necessarily rivals just because they're different. They are rivals only if they have different implications for what things are correctly labeled by the term when it's being used in the sense in question. So we can illustrate this process with reference to the 4 dictionary definitions on the screen, which I found online, of the term clock, in the sense in which it's used to refer to the things on the bottom, except for the 2 things on the right, which are not clocks, but watches, a wristwatch and a pocket watch. I should say that the data that reportive definition is trying to explain are not what you have in mind when you think about the word being used in this sense. Uh, as is pointed out by uh, Sue Atkins and Michael Rundell in their practical guide to lexicography, when you ask people to say on the basis of their understanding what a word means, they tend to leave some components out, and they will include things that are idiosyncratic to themselves. The data are rather the use of the term by people communicating to one another. So a lexicographer developing dictionary definitions nowadays will use computer corpora with as many as 100 million occurrences of words that can be electronically sorted, and you can group together the sentences where the word occurs. And as a stand-in for this, I'm using the depictions at the bottom of the screen, which are representations of things that we correctly label as clocks when we use the word in this sense. So wall clock, grandfather clock, travel alarm clock, digital clock, sundial, time clock, chest clock, sand clock. They're all clocks. Now let's have a look at these four definitions and see if they do a good job of explaining the use of the word clock to describe these things, but not the two watches. They're all, as you may have realized, definitions by genus and differentia. The genus is either instrument or device, and that's not a rival genetic classification. And indeed, even if it were in a different hierarchy, that wouldn't necessarily make the definitions rival hypotheses. In this case, I think an instrument is a kind of device, so they're both putting clocks in the same hierarchy. And the next thing that one would want to do is to say what the device is designed to do. And here they differ in substantial ways. This one says it's designed for measuring or indicating time. This one says it's for measuring time. This one, like the fourth definition, for indicating or measuring time. And this one for measuring and recording time. Well, I think it's better to say or and to have indicating as well, because the sand clock and the chest clock measure time, but they don't indicate what time it is, whereas the other clocks indicate the time, what time it is, but they don't measure it. They will not tell you how much time has elapsed. And then you need to distinguish clocks from watches, because watches also are devices for indicating or measuring time. There are stopwatches, so they're for measuring time. And here they differ substantially. The third one actually doesn't exclude watches, so it's much too broad. The second and the fourth one say that it's something other than a watch. And this is rather unsatisfactory, because how are you going to define the word watch? You're going to say it's this kind of an instrument that's other than a clock. So the whole system of definitions becomes circular. What you need is something that characterizes how clocks differ from watches without using the words clock and watch. So this is on the sort of theoretical perspective that a definition should be thought of as introducing a term into a language that does not already contain the term. So the only one that makes an attempt to distinguish clocks from watches without using either word is the first one, which says that it's not designed to be worn or carried about. But this is too broad because I'm sorry, too too narrow because it excludes travel alarm clocks, which are designed to be carried about. A better way, I think, would be to characterize clocks as timekeeping devices that are not designed to be worn on one's person. So that excludes the watches, which are designed to be worn on one's person, and it includes all the clocks. So uh, uh, basically, this example ought to convince you that dictionary definitions are not, uh, sacred text coming directly from the deity. They're fallible and they make mistakes. And I only picked one term and one set of definitions before I found some. So be skeptical. Okay, so how would we apply this idea to the task of producing a reportive definition of the term anti-Semitism? So I'm going to invite you to answer these questions in the chat. And I shall warn you in advance that Donna is saving the chat and will be sending it to me. And I will use your input as grist for my mill. I'm planning to write an article, which I've been invited to submit to a special issue of the journal Topoi on definitions and so-called conceptual engineering, an article on defining anti-Semitism. If I use your name, or if I want to use your name, I will ask your permission, of course. So I do encourage you to write something in the chat, and I'm looking forward to seeing what you have to say in answer to the questions on the screen, which I'm not going to read. I will just give some time for you to read these questions and put your answers in the chat. And I'll be looking at what you post, and then I'll go to the next slide where I tell you how I answered, and perhaps I'll comment on some of your answers. So please go ahead, and I'll have a look at the screen while you're typing. Please do it in one post if you would be so kind. Okay, I'm seeing a few answers. I see some of you are still typing and putting things in. I think I'll just go ahead and show what I came up with and comment on some of the things I saw. And thank you for posting. Um, now I'm having trouble. Here we are. So I think those of you who answered the first question said that in such a context, you would provide a minimal amount of information. This situation actually occurred to me. I said to a friend, I was about to give a talk on defining anti-Semitism, and he said, "What's that?" And without a moment's thought, I said, "It's being against Jews." I see that there were various answers to this question. The short answer, one I noticed was antipathy towards the state of Israel, unjustified challenge to its legitimacy of its existence. Others, association, mental or public, between Jews and some incorrect characteristics. So I think this kind of short answer illustrates the principle that you should provide just enough content in your definition for the purpose. So if the purpose is simply to permit decoding of what people are saying when they use the word anti-Semitism or anti-Semitic, you don't need to say very much. But if your purpose is to give people a basis for actually using the word in a sentence, then you need to say a bit more. And there's things in the book about what that more might be. In the dictionary.com online definition of the term anti-Semitism, they give 6 sentences from the web, 4 of them from the journal The Daily Beast, for the purpose of showing how to use the word in a sentence. And obviously, in an encyclopedia entry, would you want to include about anti-Semitism, where you would want to include a lot. I saw Dale just said there had to be something about the Holocaust. That's certainly true as far as I'm concerned. I thought that it would be important to talk about the history of anti-Semitism in such an article, and in particular, the expulsion of Jews from various countries over the centuries, and the painting on the screen is a reproduction of a painting of Jews leaving Spain on July the 30th, 1492, after Queen Isabella expelled all those Jews who had not converted to Christianity. So this might better be called anti-Judaism than anti-Semitism, since it didn't include those ethnic Jews who had converted to Christianity. Okay, so the next type of basic act of defining is stipulating a meaning. To stipulate a meaning is to say how it should be taken to, what it should be taken to mean in a specified context. And a standard example is an author saying at the beginning of an article or a talk how a certain term should be understood in the article or in the term, in the talk. And my definitions of the terms term, define, and definition at the beginning of the book were examples of that. So to stipulate a meaning is a kind of directive in one sense, in that it's asking the reader or hearer to interpret the word in the way specified, in the context specified. And in another respect, it's a commissive in Searle's taxonomy, in that it commits the author, if they're specifying how they themselves are going to be using the term, to actually use it in that way in the specified context, and not, for example, to import aspects of the meaning in its general use that are not part of the definition that's specified. Uh, you stipulate a meaning only if you have the authority to say how a term should be interpreted. And certainly authors do have that authority about what they themselves are authors of. Uh, Generally speaking, you do not have the authority to stipulate what somebody else means by a term or how their use of the term should be understood. And so if you try to do that, you're attempting to stipulate a meaning, but you're failing to do so. But there is an exception, and this is, for example, in the case where an agency is collecting statistics from a bunch of different contributors of data, and they do have the authority to specify how the terms should be used by which their informants give them the data. Statistical agencies are one example of this. And another one is the Federal Bureau of Investigation in the United States, which collects statistics about crimes that come to the attention of law enforcement agencies in the United States and publishes them in annual reports. And they need to specify how the terms used for the different kinds of crimes that the police officers are reporting about are defined, because in the United States there are different criminal codes in different states and territories. In the District of Columbia, there are 1,900 different law enforcement agencies reporting to the FBI. And so they had to develop uh, definitions of these terms for the different kinds of crimes. And I use in the book the example of the definition of murder and non-negligent manslaughter, which is a species of criminal homicide, the other being negligent manslaughter. I commend to you the initial part of this handbook, Uniform Crime Reporting Handbook, which is popularly known as the Green Book for obvious reasons, because it indicates the care that the FBI took to consult with its different law enforcement agencies, to go through iterations to make sure that their definitions would be understood, and different law enforcement agencies would report a given crime in the same way. It was a 3-year process. So what they do, they have a definition, a formulaic definition, which, as you see, is a definition by genus and differentia, the genus being killing, and the differentia consisting of 3 features. First, that it's willful or synonymously non-negligent. Secondly, that it's of a human being. And thirdly, that it's by another human being. Sued me for the telephone. So they also give, in a general way, a description of examples of murder and non-negligent manslaughter. But then they supplement this with 10 scenarios, of which I put 4 on the screen. And they also give examples of things that are not to be classified as murder or non-negligent manslaughter. And here too, they give scenarios, 4 of them, of cases that are not to be classified in that way. They don't have borderline cases because every crime that comes to the attention of the police has to be classified in some way. Okay, so I'm not going to give you an exercise in stipulating a meaning for the term anti-Semitism, because it's hard to imagine a situation in which one would be stipulating a meaning for a term that is in such common use and so loaded. The actual usage would kind of overwhelm any attempt to stipulate some idiosyncratic meaning. I will turn to the third act of defining a term, which is advocating a meaning, whose a product we call a positional definition. And the book distinguishes three types of positional definitions: a so-called persuasive definition of the sort identified by Charles Stevenson in his 1944 book, uh, uh, Ethics and Language, typically signaled by using the word true or real before the term being defined. So there's a claim that this is the way you should understand this emotionally loaded term, whether emotionally negative or emotionally positive, in terms of the factual criteria of its application. And I found something on the web that looked like a persuasive definition. The second type of positional definition is a so-called programmatic definition, distinguished by Israel Scheffler in his book, The Language of Education, which I think first came out in 1950, where the term does not necessarily have strong emotional connotations in contrast to the terms that Stevenson was talking about, but it's connected to some existing program of activities and so embedded into them that the definition of the term implies what this program of activities should include. And his example is the term curriculum. If you define curriculum in a certain way, then you're saying that that is what the school is responsible for. And I found what I take to be a programmatic definition on the web as illustrated. And the third type of positional definition is theoretical definition of the sort discussed in Thomas Kuhn's book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, a fancy cover for the 50th anniversary of his second edition of the book published in 1970. And what I'm thinking about is not the definitions that are already accepted within a theory, but the definitions that are proposed when the theory is first introduced. And Kuhn's book is a good locus for thinking about that, because he talks about the replacement of comprehensive theories, which he calls paradigms, by other comprehensive theories, such as the replacement of Newtonian mechanics by the theory of special relativity, in which the term velocity was redefined so as to preserve the law of the conservation of momentum. So I have an example, in fact, more than one example of such theoretical definitions in the book, including attempts to define the term life in the context of the search for life on other planets, which might, in terms of its chemistry, be quite different from life on ours. The definition displayed is the definition by NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Organization, of life. So what about advocating a meaning for the term anti-Semitism? I'm going to ask you to put in the chat one comment, either analytical or evaluative, of the definition that is on the screen. I'm not going to read any of that content, but I do want to say something about this organization, International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, which adopted this definition at a plenary session in May of 2016, including the examples and the thing that is said not to be an example of anti-Semitism. So this is not a Jewish organization. It is an alliance of governments of various countries, founded by a former prime minister of Sweden. And it included, at the time that this definition was adopted, 31 countries, including Canada and the United States. And the United States, the State Department has in fact subsequently adopted this definition as its definition of anti-Semitism. I should say one more thing, that the Holocaust that this alliance is remembering is not just the Holocaust that killed all the Jews, but the Holocaust that killed all the Roma. So it's not just remembering the Nazis killing of Jews, but also because they were Jews, but also the killing of Roma, so-called gypsies, because they are Roma. So I'm going to stop, give you some time to put in the chat one comment, analytical or evaluative, about any aspect of the definition that you see on the screen. And then I will share with you my own responses to it. Okay, some of you may still be writing, but I'm going to proceed if I can. These things are tricky. Um, so I noticed a couple of you made the point that not all anti-Semitism is hatred. I would think that the definition actually accommodates this objection in the sense that it says that it's a certain perception that may be expressed as hatred. A very good point I thought was that the definition by defining anti-Semitism as a certain kind of perception doesn't allow for the recognition of institutional anti-Semitism that may not be based on any particular perception. And certainly in my part of the world, historically, in the 1930s, there was a lot of exclusion of Jews, which I would characterize as anti-Semitic. Who knows what it was based on? In my city of Hamilton, they were not allowed to join any golf clubs, the private golf clubs. So the Jewish community started its own. There was a sign on at least one beach in Toronto in the 1930s, no Jews or dogs allowed. Who knows what was behind that, and so on. So my comments are that occurred to me, and there may be others that occur to me, and thank you for your input. First, I thought there was a certain pragmatic contradiction in adopting something as a resolution at a general meeting of the Alliance, and then saying that it's not legally binding and that it's a working definition. A working definition suggests that it's on the way to some kind of a final adoption of a definition, but this is the adoption of a definition, and calling it working doesn't necessarily make it working. So what I sense here is the reluctance of some of the governments that belong to the alliance to be committed by this resolution to actually endorsing it themselves. I thought, as an analytical comment, that the definition was vague in many places. It said that anti-Semitism was a certain perception of Jews, but it didn't say what kind of perception. It said that it may be expressed as hatred, but didn't say how else it might be expressed. And the examples that it gives are said that they may be examples of anti-Semitism, that it depends on the context. So you don't have, for example, clear scenarios of the kind that are in the FBI's definition of murder and non-negligent manslaughter that are unequivocally cases of anti-Semitism or anti-Semitic statements or behavior. It's a definition at its core by genus and differentia, as you may have noticed. And I actually questioned whether it was correct to put it in the genus of perception. So insofar as we're talking about individual people who are anti-Semitic in some way or other, it would seem to me to be more reasonable to think of their being anti-Semitic as a kind of attitude towards Jews, which not necessarily of hatred, as a couple of commentators said, but perhaps hostility, perhaps just dislike, anyway, some kind of negative attitude to people just on the basis of their being Jews. I thought it did a good thing in identifying the target of anti-Semitism, and it probably should be said that the target nowadays is Jews as an ethnic group and not specifically people who practice the Jewish religion. It didn't help the Jews in Europe occupied by the Nazis that they were not practicing Jews, that they were fully assimilated, that they didn't personally regard themselves as Jewish. If they were ethnically of that background, they were taken off to the camps and killed. I thought the list of examples of manifestations of anti-Semitism was very helpful, although, as I said, it would be more helpful if they were spelled out in more detailed scenarios. And it was good that there is something recognized as not being anti-Semitism, but it would be better if there were a more detailed list. So I suspect that I might try in this article on defining anti-Semitism that I have in mind to write, or I'm committed to write, to say how this definition might be improved. So thank you for those comments. And just to recapitulate, I pointed out that a definition has three dimensions. The act of the definer, which can be reporting or stipulating or advocating a meaning, not necessarily mutually exclusive acts. And we looked at an example of reporting a meaning, of the term anti-Semitism, my off-the-cuff definition as being against Jews. And we looked at an example of this definition of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, which I take to be advocating a meaning for the term anti-Semitism. The other two dimensions are the content of the definition and the form of the definition. I didn't say too much about them, but be willing to respond to questions or comments about those dimensions in the chat. And there's my email address if you wish to get in touch with me. This thing is being recorded and will be on the YouTube. So you're able to go and have a look at it if you don't write it down right now and want to contact me. So thanks for your attention, and I look forward to your comments and questions, and I will stop sharing my screen.
Thank you very much. I will open the floor to questions or comments. You might have to unmute yourself. I'm not sure. I have one then, failing anything else. Are you aware, I heard someone say yesterday that the current definition of anti-Semitic has been pretty contested right now, probably certainly in light of recent events. Have you been keeping up with that? Do you know what some of the controversies around that definition might be, or around a definition of anti-Semitism?
Not specifically, and that's something I do need to investigate. I do know that Jewish organizations like B'nai B'rith, which defend human rights, and particularly the human rights of Jews, have urged political parties to adopt this IRHA definition of anti-Semitism and commit to it. And they have used this definition to characterize certain behaviors as anti-Semitic, to which the persons engaging in these behaviors have responded by denying that their behavior was anti-Semitic. So the problem is that people who are vigorously defending the rights of Palestinians and expressing concern for the suffering, in particular at the moment, of Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, if their expressions of concern are completely one-sided, for example, ignoring the plight of the hostages being held by Hamas, which is an acronym for the Arabic equivalent of Islamic resistance movement, and expressing, without expressing concern for the terrible atrocities that this Palestinian Islamic resistance movement committed in Israel on October the 7th of last year. They are accused of being anti-Semitic because of their one-sidedness. There are a group of pro-Palestinian activists who are demonstrating every day in a part of the city of Toronto, which is a Jewish neighborhood. They are at the exit from the freeway into this neighborhood, and they are yelling at the people passing by. Some of them are yelling, go back to Ukraine, go back to Poland. Those statements, I would think, are anti-Semitic. Um, they're being directed at these people just because they're Jewish, and it's certainly a negative attitude towards them. But I find it very problematic for organizations like B'nai B'rith to use the IRHA definition of anti-Semitism as a basis for characterizing anything as anti-Semitic because it's so vague. It needs to be sharpened up, and it needs to recognize borderline cases, and it needs to have more detail about things that somebody might think are anti-Semitic, but that should not really be classified as anti-Semitic. And I think, just to add a little more comment about that, perhaps it's better to be trying to define the adjective anti-Semitic than to try to define the noun anti-Semitism, because anti-Semitic behavior, speech, painting swastikas on synagogues and things like that may or may not reflect some specific attitude. So this is a meandering answer to your question. If there's something more you want to add, I'd be happy to respond to it.
No, that's an excellent answer. Are there any other questions?
Well, I have a comment. I think there's an issue of double standards. If somebody questions whether Jews have a right to a country of their own, well, if they think all other groups have such a right, then that would seem anti-Semitic. But if someone takes the view that no group has a right to a country of their own, that's not inherently anti-Semitic. That's a general proposition. So I think that's one of the problems with the definition. It's not clear on whether there's a double standard, which could indicate anti-Semitism, or just a general concern about Israel, or about what groups have a right to a nation of their own, or something like that, which is a complex matter and not necessarily a matter of anti-Semitism.
That's an interesting comment. Thank you. I find actually quite dubious the proposition that each ethnic group is entitled to a country of its own, regardless of what the ethnic group is. Maybe it's easier to say this when you're in a country like Canada, living in a neighborhood where on my block there are Tamils, Pakistanis, Chinese, mixed Indonesian Chinese, and God knows who else, all living together quite happily in harmony. Yes, thank you for the comment. I agree.
A quick comment here. We often discuss how we kind of living in the age of the denial of facts, and I think that kind of also involves the denial of sort of reportive definitions. And I think that does happen a lot with the standard usage of anti-Semitism, because in many instances, any criticism whatsoever of the current military practices of Israel with respect to Gaza, pointing out just rather the indiscriminate bombing and that sort of thing, and pointing out just how weak the double effect argument is when Netanyahu says, but we don't intend to kill any Palestinian civilians, we just intend to kill Hamas. And to kind of point that out, no, that's not a justifiable defense here. You have to be more careful. That sort of criticism against the military is often just met with, oh, you're anti-Semitic. And that's really unfortunate. So it's sort of, even if we would have a an agreed upon definition, more or less. It's the abuse of definitions too, or the ignoring of them, that is just kind of the genesis for most of the controversy and the sort of straw man argumentation that's going on here.
Yes, thank you for that comment. I think David Moshman's comment applies very well here. If the kinds of criticism of the Israeli military operation in Gaza are the sort of thing that you would make in a similar situation in another war, there's nothing anti-Semitic about them. And it is an abuse to call criticisms of the kind that it would be reasonable for a fair-minded person to make of that operation anti-Semitic. Or, for example, to label such criticisms as a blood libel, when in fact there's a good reason for thinking that they are true, and you're just taking a phrase that characterizes a certain kind of anti-Semitic trope and applying it improperly to this particular case.
Well, I see that we are up at 11 o'clock, so I will say on behalf of ALACT, thank you so much, David Hitchcock, for a very thought-provoking talk. And this will be up, this video will be up on our YouTube channel, hopefully by the end of the weekend. And I wish you all a wonderful rest of your day. Bye.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone.
Thank you for
Thank you,
your
David.
attention.
Thank you, David. Very good.
Bye-bye.
Nice
Take
to
care.
see everybody.